Welcome to a first lecture in our seminar TOPOS this semester, where we are looking at the relation between abstraction and time, mathematics and the arts, empathy and abstraction, and topics like this. We chose as a kind of a motivic key for this seminar the idea of the lighthouse and also a particular text by Virginia Woolf entitled To the Lighthouse. The text is this one here. This is the first edition from 1927, I think. And I like this particularly because you have a kind of a structure here where something emits towards the upside, but also towards the downside. Yeah? So there is a kind of it's almost like a pump. It's not clear, of course, how we can interpret this, but it's a very smart jacket cover, dust jacket cover, I would say, for the first edition of this. The story is the story of a family, the Ramseys, which entertain a summer holiday house with many guests. And if there is a plot, a concrete plot, at least in the beginning of the text, it is about the planned journey to this lighthouse here, the God-Revi Lighthouse, which is close to the shore where the village, where this guest house of the Ramsey family is located, actually is. It's a short transit from the shore to the lighthouse, but we will see how it nevertheless remains quite unreachable. There is one particular aspect that in my lecture I would like to think about, and it's this strange function of a lighthouse, no? To keep a light burning as a kind of a signal post. So it's a way of relating to light that signals, that is not meaningful in itself, that is not brilliant, that is not insightful, that kind of goes counter or transverses the usual narratives of how we relate the role of light in relation to understanding. This is a recent edition of the book. I just show it because here this emitting of light is quite drastic. So what is it all about? I prepared a document with a few keywords before I want to go into the text, and with particular passages try to suggest a few of the readings that can help you to anchor or to place some of the considerations that we meet and that we develop in the seminar. As a kind of a motto, I think, a critic, David Daishes, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, I think grasped quite beautifully what I also perceive very much when reading this text. He said, in respect to Virginia Woolf's novel, to reach the lighthouse, this is in a sense to make contact with the truth outside oneself. The text itself is organized in 3 parts. It begins with a first part entitled The Window, a second part which is entitled Time Passes, and a third one which is called The Lighthouse. The novel is a modernist novel. It's one of the very important ones, in the sense that it began to subvert classical narrative structure, so the fixity of language, then the univocity of the narrative language, and also to have a narrator and dramatic voices which would speak in dialogue. This is being subverted. We have a strange kind of narrator which is really experiencing. The voice is narrating a manner of experiencing, but this experiencing is projecting the speaker into a very emphatic and also a very affective relation to everything that is being narrated. So we don't really know who is talking when, and we also don't know about the identity of the distinguished characters, not even the voice itself. So there's a game of a subversion going on, which has a lot to do, I would say, precisely with this intention, how to make contact with the truth outside oneself. We will see that there is a specific interest in what comes again and again and again throughout Virginia Woolf's text, which is this notion of a transfixity. So it's an interest in not entirely dissolving such fixity. It's not about creating a continuous kind of immanence or belonging or fluidity, but rather it's about a kind of a dynamics that that follows a movement of transing, of passing through, of percolating, of transgressing as well, but not really entirely leaving. So we will come back to how we can see this in the text. It is an important relation with regard to our interest in mathematics and the arts, no? In mathematics and poetics, ultimately the relation between form, quantity, and history, or time that passes. So let's, before we start, also think a little bit about what a lighthouse does. A lighthouse is a house that is to give orientation for those on sea, for those who have left the shores, for those who have gone off for adventures or for transit to somewhere else. And what the light does is a signaling function. So it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't really communicate any content or any knowledge, but it helps the people offshore on the sea not to run on grounds. Yeah? So it helps that the ships don't ground. This is a very symbolical picture, I think, because it kind of suspends, or it keeps in suspension what of course many people long for, which is a kind of a stability, a stable ground. So it promises to help navigating self-passage when going out to the seas or when coming back. Now, from another angle, how is a lighthouse maintained? Somebody needs to be there. Somebody needs, literally, and this is of course in times before electricity, we could perhaps say, but in its symbolic aspect it still remains valid. Somebody needs to keep the light burning. No? It's a bit like with the Olympic light. No? There is a cultic, there is a ritualistic side to it, which is of an uttermost pragmatics at the same time. Somebody needs to keep the light burning. So the function of the lighthouse does not depend in any way or on a kind of a will, on a semantic will, on a message, on a communication of some insight or an intention that would provide an outlook. It does not even really provide an outlook. No? It kind of keeps a relation of the moment to a projected future and also to a projected past in suspense. So it's a point of reference that is non-referential. This is not a contradiction, it's part of everything that signals. Signaling participates in a vicarious kind of structure. Vicarious means there are places, but the places are not occupied by any substantial property, or somebody would belong there, but by substitutes. There is a replacement of the people who occupy a position in a vicarious order without impacting the logics or the consistency of such an order. And this applies to the lighthouse as well. But the person who went to live in a lighthouse had to submit to utter solitude, so to a life of one's own. And yet it is not a monastic kind of community, with other people who are also subject to a kind of a life in solitude, in shared solitude in the case of monasteries. But rather the lighthouse is in the service of a here and now. It is not in the service of a transcendent beyond. It is very much in the service of a here and now. And yet, being in the service of this here and now, and precisely in the way that it does this kind of service, it is in profound acknowledgement of what we could call the vastness of the seas, the unsteadiness of the weather, the dependency upon the weather, no? Existential natural forces, powers, the wielding of natural forces that cannot be entirely controlled or constrained. And the boundedness of the dry lands as well. Yeah? So the promise is limited. So this we can think of the dry land, of the continent, of the place of the earth where we can stand, where there is mainly gravity linking us to a position which we can accommodate and inhabit. So it's a kind of acknowledgement of a sort of a transcendental boundedness, I would say. And it's a transcendental boundedness where the boundaries are not fixed, but the boundaries come to be actualized respective to how one relates to those boundaries. So they remain in a certain way extremely existential, but also virtual, because they unfold or they allow contact. No, so boundedness also means there is a being in touch. A boundedness means there is a limit, and if there is a limit, there can be touch, there can be encounters. It's a boundedness between what I would call several immensities. So magnitudes that can't properly be rationalized. Immensities means we can't count it. There is not one form to it. It is too large. It is of a greater magnitude than what we can reasonably build upon. And the lighthouse is a very precise symbol, but we should perhaps say, for precisely such a thing. So these immensities, what do I mean? No? So very importantly, these immensities unfold between a distinction between privacy and publicness, but also civicness, also hostility and hospitality, also intimacy, sharing, difference as well, then providing and receiving, but also anchoring, firmness, rationality, irrationality, feeling, abstraction, very much, we will see abstraction in respect to experience, but also a plenitude of emotion, and the possibility for clarity, the inevitability of deprivations, the complexity of receiving, of acknowledging, and of desiring. So, Virginia Woolf's text starts like this. The first part is entitled The Window. Yes, of course. If it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsey. But you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy. As if it were settled, the exhibition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great clan, which cannot keep this feeling separate from that, but must let future prospects, with their joys and sorrows, cloud what is actually at hand, since to such people, even in earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom and radiance rests. James Ramsey, sitting on the floor, cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalogue of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. It was fringed with joy, the wheelbarrow, the lawn-mower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling. All these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language, though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly round the refrigerator, imagined him all red and ermine on the bench, or directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis or public affairs. So what we have is a promise of an adventure. No? It's the outlook of an adventure, namely to undertake a journey to the lighthouse, which is specifically addressing a little boy of 6 years, her son, who has a vivid imagination. Yeah? I said, so whatever he imagines is so vivid that it creates an abundance of impressions in his mind, which is so uncontrollable that he invented what she tells us, a private code, a secret language, in order to deal with the liveliness, with the reality of these emotions. But a secret code is a private language. He cannot communicate. He cannot share what he feels. We will see how this is a motif that goes throughout the whole text. So what happens next? What happens next is that the father, Mr. Ramsey, intervenes. What he says is, but it won't be fine. The weather will not be fine. So he crashes the outlook to the expedition. He crashes it, and what we hear from our narrator is this: had there been an axe handy, a poker, or any weapon that could have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, there and then James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsey excited in his children's breast by his mere presence, standing as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some respect, with some secret conceit at his own accuracy of judgment. What he said was true. It was always true. He was incapable of untruth, never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all of his own children, who, sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising, and the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks founder in darkness. Here Mr. Ramsey would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon, one that needs above all courage, truth, and the power to endure. Yeah? So here you can already see this kind of going under the skin of the characters. The narrative voice here goes into the psyche of the little boy and tells us his experience, the reality of his experience. What we hear is again Mrs. Ramsey in response to it. But it may be fine. I expect it will be fine, said Mrs. Ramsey, making some little twist of the reddish-brown stocking she was knitting impatiently. If she finished it tonight, if they did go to the lighthouse after all, it was to be given to the lighthouse's keeper for his little boy, who was threatened with a tuberculosis hip, together with a pile of old magazines and some tobacco, indeed whatever she could find laying about, not really wanted, but only littering the room, to give those poor fellows who must be bored to death sitting all day with nothing to do but polish the lamp and trim the wick and rake about on their scrap of garden, something to amuse them. For how would you like to be shut up for a whole month at a time, and possibly more, in stormy weather, upon a rock the size of a tennis lawn, she would ask, and to have no letters or newspapers, and to see nobody, if you were married, not to see your wife, not to know how your children were, if they were ill, if they had fallen down and broken their legs or arms, to see their same dreary waves breaking week after week, and then a dreadful storm coming, and the windows covered with spray, and birds dashed against the lamp, and the whole place rocking, and not to be able to put your nose out of doors for fear of being swept into the sea. How would you like that? She asked, addressing herself particularly to her daughters. So she added rather differently, one must take them whatever comforts one can. Again, what I want to show you is how this voice slips into the realities. It's one and the same side of the plot that is happening, but many ways of experiencing it. All of them true to a certain extent. But let's remember, the chapter begins with a framing, which is the window. And this window is now not simply a window through space, from an inside to an outside. It's not really a window which provides an outlook or which lets something in. It's a window which is a virtual window to the promise of an expedition, of something exciting. And what it unfolds, or the sight that it captures, is the complexity of what such a promise incites, what it actualizes, what it lets loose. And what you see is that this figure here, so while Mr. Ramsey, with his disillusionment, is utterly, we could say, realist and rationalist, he knows the weather will not be fine because the weather is by all likeliness not going to change overnight. The signs are not good. So it's a process of judgment which makes the little boy super angry and frustrated, no? But also which has an authority that just cannot be neglected. It's a fact. No? It was always true. And this, what is the term for that? You can't escape it. It's always true, and yet you don't want it. So this kind of conflict is being lived through in relation to this. And Mrs. Ramsey's response is interesting because she doesn't give that much weight to the realism of the situation. Rather, she empathizes further. She empathizes with the people living there. She's not so much only thinking about her little boy who wants to go there. She's thinking about the people living there. She's thinking what kind of comfort she could provide. And this is another key point. So there is an intricate play going on throughout the novel between gendered and sexed identities, so between feminine and masculine, between child and adults, between mother and kids, and father and kids, and so on. But this is not really the aspect I want to foreground in my lecture. What is important is that there is a kind of, and this is very, I would say, transfixed. There is a relation of the feminine voice of Mrs. Ramsey, which seems to be utterly irrational. And this is what Mr. Ramsey, her husband, actually accuses her of. No, she says, when she insists, but the weather might be fine. And of course it's true, it might be fine. No, we all know that the weather is not entirely predictable. But he gets very angry. Mr. Ramsey gets very angry at that. He says, there wasn't the slightest possible chance that they could go to the lighthouse tomorrow. But how did he know? His wife asks him. The winds often change. And this extraordinary irrationality of her remark, the folly of women's minds, enraged him. So now the narrative voice goes into his perception. He had ridden through the valley of death, been shattered and shivered, and now she flew in the face of facts, made his children hope what was utterly out of the question. In effect, she told lies. He stamped his foot on the stone step. Damn you, he said. But what had she said? Simply that it might be fine tomorrow, and so it might. And it goes on, and it goes on. Yeah? So you can see that there are rationalities in play that pertain to different immensities. This is what I want to suggest to you. Yeah? So there is a very clear rationality of Mrs. Ramsey's reasoning, but there is also a very clear one of their sons and of Mr. Ramsey's as well. So we will see Mr. Ramsey is in the plot. He's a figure. He's a metaphysician. Yeah? So he's an intellectual. He is a person who, commits himself to science, to philosophy more than science probably. Yeah? To philosophy. So metaphysics always means one accepts that there are immensities, no, that cannot entirely be rationalized. Every metaphysics needs therefore to begin with the setting up of a principle. And this is the interesting fact with regard to the lighthouse, no? Because it is a kind of a principle, a signaling principle, a principle which at one and the same time opens up promises without promising that it can fulfill those promises. Yeah, it's a kind of a farewell promise. But it's also not without responsibility. And this is a point where Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey are very much in touch with each other. So this is also constitutive for their relation, arguably. We will not go into that. What is a very interesting formulation that we find a little bit later in the text is this one here. So Mrs. Ramsey, she refuses, she says nonsense, but this with great severity. So, and then we learn that to her, exaggeration is an important habit, and that implications, there are great implications that also unfold other aspects of her action. So this irrationality is the same when she is so utterly hospitable, when she invites many people. No. But the sentence I'm interested in is this one here. Indeed, she had the whole of the other sex under her protection, for reasons she could not explain, and so on. So this formulation, she has the whole of the other sex under her protection. This is a very interesting sentence because there are plenty of indications, of course, that the power game goes in one direction, that the women are being held small and so on, all the stories that we are very much familiar with in terms of accusation. But what we have here is a different aspect which surfaces at the same time. And this is, I would strongly suggest, because there is an engagement with rationalities relative to immensities. No? So we get different profiles. They're all experiencing the same reality, but very differently so. And it's not clear how wie die Würfel gefallen sind, no? How the dices are cast. It's not clear at all, and it remains in suspense until the end of the story. So she's actually a very powerful figure. No? She has the whole of the other sex under her protection, and this is an interesting formulation because it kind of generalizes from, let's say, a very feminine capacity, which is to trigger seductions, no? And then so this very aspect is, on the one hand, affirmatively turned into a positive, so under her protection, but on the other hand, the whole of the other sex. So it's raised to a metaphysical level. This is the characterization we get from her. When you will read through the text, you will immediately see how this is indeed what she does. This is part of we could say the mechanics of her empathizing with all the social emotions, with all the human and social and all kinds of relations, the emotions that are played out there within. So it's a kind of a rationality of feeling, we could say. It's an interest also to rationalize feeling, because it's very much her own ambition to actually do this. No? So to have the whole of the other sex under protection. How can she do this? We get a very interesting explanation of this. I want to read that passage again because it is so dense, and it's good for you to have the real words, not only my circumscriptions. What we read here is this. I entitled it a kind of a carpet voice. No? So where does she ground this rationality of emotions? Or where is she when she empathizes so much? So we read, but here, as Mrs. Ramsey turned the page, suddenly her search for the picture of a rake or a mowing machine was interrupted, so she's helping her little son finding pictures to cut out. The gruff murmur, irregularly broken by the taking out of pipes and the putting in of pipes, which had kept on assuring her, so she could not hear what was said, as she sat in the window, which opened on the terrace, that the men were happily talking. This sound, which had lasted now half an hour and had taken its place soothingly in the scale of sounds pressing on the top of her, such as the tap of balls upon bats, the sharp sudden bark now and then, how's that, of the children playing cricket. It had ceased. so that the monotonous fall of the waves on the beach, which for the most part beat a measured and soothing tattoo to her thoughts, and seemed consolingly to repeat over and over again, as she sat with the children, the words of some old cradle song murmured by nature, "I am guarding you, I am your support." But at other times, suddenly and unexpectedly, especially when her mind raised itself slightly from the task actually in hand, had no such kindly meaning, but like a ghostly roll of drums remorselessly beat the measure of life, made one think of the destruction of the island and its engulfment in the sea, and warned her, whose day had slipped past in one quick doing after another, that it was all ephemeral, as a rainbow. This sound, which had been obscured and concealed under the other sounds, suddenly thundered hollow in her ears and made her look up with an impulse of terror. So I entitled this the first slide, when you remember, diachronicity. It's a way of relating through time where we have layered levels, we could say, or they're not levels, they're like strata that coexist, that overlay, that take over, that blank out, and then also expose. So this emphatic way of moving, of doing one thing after the other, of passing the day in one moment, by always anticipating, by always responding and orienting, and giving orientation to everybody in terms of what can be the next step, what does somebody need now, what can be facilitated, how can there be provided comfort to everybody, because that is mainly what this character does in the story. There is something at the bottom of it, a murmuring, something utterly destructive. So there is an activity in the measure of life, and below it there is the swelling sea, we could say. Everything can be swept away in an instant. And the voice of this person, of Mrs. Ramsey, is constantly in between those two realities, performing, but also feeling the sound that is how is it formulated here? Pressing on top of her, the ordinary, the sounds of the people whom she wants to take care of, that are under her protection, but from the bottom as well, something the others cannot perceive, kind of a carpet voice. Now there is another very interesting female character in the play. It is Lily Briscott, I think, if I remember right. And she's a painter. She's not very confident in her painting. So it's another one of these aspects where we have easily a very stereotyped kind of setup, where women are hindered in unfolding their creativity, in gaining confidence in themselves, and so on. And clearly this is one aspect of what we are told, what we are shown, what is being demonstrated by the story. But it's only one part of it. So this Lily is a really interesting character, because her relation to sorting experiences is again of a kind of a rationality which is very different from the one of Mrs. Ramsey or Mr. Ramsey. So when she paints, she is a bit like James, who has his secret code, but who cannot communicate with anybody. And her ambition is that to find through painting a way of communicating. Communicating doesn't mean to exchange sense-making statements or something like that. We will see. This is in terms of what will be called a transaction between oneself and life. A transaction involves the actual passing over of something of substance, even if it's symbolical, like in monetary transactions. Transaction has, at one and the same time, an uttermost intimacy and an uttermost sterility at the same time. And this is an interesting setup again for the whole situation, which we could of course describe as moments of creativity. So between the sea and the shore, finding a signaling orientation, looking out for totally for positions in utter solitude, so not the social kind of common topoi, the common ground where one doesn't hear the room ring of the carpet voice below. So we could say it's the site or the situation of creativity, but what we get here is this double articulation of, at one time, an enormous intimacy, which is sterile. Yeah? So creativity always has the problem of relating or clarifying its relation to concept and to conception. So this is on a surface level, of course, metaphorical. So a concept and a conception. This is also how we describe the conception of a child in the intercourse, in the sexual act. But concepts also are the key idea in a logics, no, in a dimension of language that would not be subject necessarily to the impacts of time. So it's an interesting framing of that, which is not a usual one. Yeah, it doesn't follow the stereotypes. It's a bit. I'm pointing this out because there are so many secondary texts on Virginia Woolf's beautiful book, which just destroy the entire subtlety in which she argues by using it as a ground to demonstrate stereotypical aspects only. So this Lily Briscoe, what we hear her say now here, or think, no, in this projected voice that gets intimate with all the characters. What would a stranger think now? What did this Lily Briscoe think? That's actually the voice of somebody else. Okay, let's keep this part away and focus on that. That's the one that I was interested in. No. So here she tells us what she learned from Mr. Ramsey, this metaphysician, the intellectual who never follows emotions, who always wants to be the voice of clarity and sobriety. What she learns from him, so she appreciates his work, and but she has no way of understanding it. So the way she puts it is this. We learn, whenever she thought of his work, she always saw clearly before her a large kitchen table. And it was Andrew's doing. She asked him what his father's books were about. Subject and object and the nature of reality, Andrew had said. Andrew is another kid of the Ramseys. And when she said heavens, she had no notion of what that meant. Think of a kitchen table then, he told her, when you are not there. Yeah? Think of a kitchen table when you are not there. So this kind of projecting into a point of the outside where one is and is not there. This is what she interestingly shares with Ramsey. So she is the painter. No? So she is the person seeking this kind of intimacy relation. And here we get an insight of her own perception of painting. So we learn about the intensity of her experience. The Jackmanna was bright violet, the wall staring white. She would not have considered it honest to tamper with the bright violet and the staring white, since she saw them like that, fashionable, so it was, since Mr. Pounceford's visit to see everything pale, elegant, semi-transparent. Okay, so what we learn now is how the intensity of her experience is, of course, impacted. Not impacted, is affected by encounters she has. Then, beneath the color, there was the shape. She doesn't focus on the distraction. No? So then, beneath the color, there was the shape. She could see it all so clearly, so commandingly when she looked. It was when she took her brush in hand that the whole thing changed. It was in that moment's flight between the picture and her canvas that the demons set on her, who often brought her to the verge of tears and made this passage from conception to work as dreadful as any down a dark passage for a child. Such she often felt herself, struggling against terrific odds to maintain her courage, to say, but this is what I see, this is what I see. And so to clasp some miserable remnant of her vision to her breast, which 1,000 forces did their best to pluck from her. And it was then too, in that chill and windy way, as she began to paint, that there forced themselves upon her other things. Her own inadequacy, her insignificance, keeping house for her father off the Brompton Road, and had much ado to control her impulse to fling herself at Mrs. Ramsey's knee and say to her, but what could one say to her? Okay, let's pause for a moment. What we hear here is these torments, no? These storms, these weathers of the soul, from a projected situation into the skin of this character of Lily Briscoe and her experience as a painter, in sorting out the flood of these emotions, the flood of the intensities of the perception. So she has a very interesting relation to Mrs. Ramsey. It's not entirely clear whether she is in love with Mrs. Ramsey or in what way she is in love with her. But there is also a kind of a competition between them. So she longs for what she perceives that Mrs. Ramsey has, this power to keep the whole of the other sex under protection. Whereas she herself is more about exposure. It's about drawing out. It's about bringing into a manifest form with the painting. Yeah. So in a way, she would like to do with the painting what she perceives that Mrs. Ramsey is able. So there is an interesting mimesis relation at work, which involves desires, which involves many things, many complex things. And here we find her meditating, no? But what could one say to her? I am in love with you. No, that was not true. I am in love with this all. Waving her hand at the edge of the house at the children. It was absurd, it was impossible. So now she laid her brushes neatly in the box, side by side, and said to William Banks is another character who is present at this situation. She begins to say, let's leave. Yeah, so it gets too complicated. But this kind of, so you see this reality of the seas, of the torments, of the storms, we have it in the reality, in the symbolic reality of all the different characters in different ways. And yet there is something invariant about them, between all of them. So here we have a less self-destructive passage by Mrs. Briscoe, by Lily Briscoe, by the painter, when she muses, why is she painting? What is she looking for? And she thinks, how then did it work out, all this? How did one judge people? Think of them. How did one add up this and that and conclude that it was liking one felt or disliking? And to those words, what meaning attached? After all, standing now, apparently transfixed, here it is again, our word, apparently transfixed by the pear tree, impressions poured in upon her of those two men, and to follow her thought was like following a voice which speaks too quickly to be taken down by everyone's pencil, and the voice was her own voice, saying without prompting undeniable, everlasting, contradictory things, so that even the fissures and humps in the bark of the pear tree were irrevocably fixed there for eternity. No, that's the conflict you have as a painter. You fix things, inevitably, by bringing it to the canvas. So that's what she described as the process from conception to the work. So she continues, you have greatness. But Mr. Ramsey had none of it. Here she had actually addresses this other character. I forgot his name now, who is also, it's an interesting character because he's an intellectual like Mr. Ramsey, but he is not an important scholar. So he never wrote something that is considered to contribute to the canon. So something of greater significance. His wife has died. He's a kind of a sad character in one way, but also a very generous one. And they both develop an interesting and a nice relation. We will come back to that. But here she thinks about the two in relation to each other. Yeah? And she is, this character is the first one and the only one that she would reveal her painting to. So she wants him to see it, and we will see what that entails. So this reality of manifesting paintings which involve or which come out of such struggles, of such storms, such inner storms. Why is it important to have somebody witness that or to relate to that? It will be this Mr. Here, Mr. Banks. And what we hear here is a comparison between the two. So she says, "You have greatness," she continued, "but Mr. Ramsey has none of it. He is petty, selfish, vain, egoistical." So that's the strange thing, no? This Mr. Ramsey, who actually achieved something of significance, as one would objectively say, he's totally vain. He's always seeking for appreciation. He is not confident in himself at all. And this other character here is much more confident, but has a very different history. "You have greatness," she continued, "but Mr. Ramsey has none of it. He is petty, selfish, vain, egotistical. He is spoiled, he is a tyrant, he wears Mrs. Ramsey to death. But he has what you have not, a fiery unworldliness. He knows nothing about trifles. He loves dogs and his children. He has 8. Mr. Banks has none. Did he not come down in 2 coats the other night and let Mrs. Ramsey trim his hair into a pudding basin? All of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate but all marvelously controlled in an invisible elastic net, danced upon and down in Lily's mind, in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung, in effigy, danced up and down in Lily's mind, in and about the branches of the pear tree, where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table." No? What Mr. Ramsey is concerned with. Think of a kitchen table when you are not there. Symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsey's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released. A shot went off close at hand, and there came, flying from its fragments, frightened, effusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. So it's a continuity between an inner kind of explosion, which gets a symbolical embodiment in something that actually comes flying by. So it's part of the rationality that she is concerned with. But you see how there is abstraction in this, yeah? So and what we are interested in is to learn to relate to abstraction as something which doesn't belong to either one side. So here is another passage where she muses. What is wisdom? Was it knowledge? This is again Lily Briscoe, the painter. Was it once more the deceptiveness of beauty, so that all one's perceptions halfway to truth were tangled in a golden mesh? Or did she lock up within her some secret which certainly Lily Briscoe believed people must have for the world to go on at all? Everyone could not be as helter-skelter, hand-to-mouth as she was. But if they knew, could they tell one what they knew? Sitting on the floor with her arms around Mrs. Ramsay's knees, this is again the situation where they kind of share an intimacy for a moment. Close as she could get, smiling to think that Mrs. Ramsay would never know the reason of that pressure. She imagined how in the chambers of the mind and heart of the woman who was physically touching her were stood, like the treasures in the tombs of kings, tablets bearing sacred inscriptions which, if one could spell them out, would teach one everything. But they would never be offered openly, never made public. What art was there known to love or cunning by which one pressed through into these secret chambers? What device for becoming like waters poured into one jar, inextricably the same, one with the object one adored? Now, here you have this longing, no, of a complicated kind of love. Could the body achieve, or the mind, subtly mingling in the intricate passages of the brain or the heart, could loving, as people called it, make her and Mrs. Ramsay one? For it was not knowledge, but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to man, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsey's knees. So Lily Briscoe and Mr. Ramsey, in a way, are like inverses. So we have with Mr. Ramsey this blanking out of the emotional reality, but at the same time an utter ease. We are told, he's easy. So yes, James, the youngest kid, is emotionally very challenged by his father, but he loves to be with the children. He's not bothered by the messiness, by the confusion, by the complexity of everything. He has an ease with this liveliness, which in a way would often appear as if it's a contradiction. So we have other characters where it really is a contradiction. They cannot engage in a social way. Mr. Ramsey can. And Lily Briscoe, she would like, so she has this social proximity to a similar degree of abstractness, perhaps, like Mr. Ramsey has with the intellectual clarity, so a clarity and emotional clarity, and just like Mr. Ramsey, she is very secluded with that. So in a lighthouse, we could say. So what I would like to suggest is precisely this: the characters are all in one and the same time caught up in a lighthouse, but the lighthouse becomes the site where a plot in which nothing happens can take place, something like that. So when Lily paints, she does not attempt to paint something of likeness. So first of all, it's very important to have the instrument at hand. So she can perceive, she has this intensity when she has the pencil, when she has the instrument for drawing, and she needs to fight with herself of showing it to somebody. This is the struggle we have here. So she said to herself, one must. She braced herself to stand an awful trial of someone looking at her picture. One must, she said, one must. And if it must be seen, Mr. Banks was less alarming than another. But that any other eyes should see the residue of her 33 years. So she says, with this kind of, that's the kind of abstraction at stake here. So one painting, the residue of her 33 years. The deposit of each day's living mixed with something more secret than she had ever spoken or shown in the course of all those days was an agony, and at the same time it was immensely exciting. So then we hear Mr. Banks, when he looks at it, asks her what did she see to indicate by the triangular purple shape just there, he asks. So now we get precise clues. Her painting is geometrical. She tries to grasp with abstractions what she seeks to put to work from her conception. It was Mrs. Ramsey's reading to James, she said. She knew his objection, that no one could tell it for a human shape. But she had made no attempt at likeness. For what reason had she introduced them then? He asked. Why indeed, except that if there, in that corner, it was bright, here, in this, she felt the need of darkness. Simple, obvious, commonplace, as it was, Mr. Banks was interested. Mother and child, then, objects of universal veneration, and in this case the mother was famous for her beauty, might be reduced, he pondered, to a purple shadow without irreverence. Interesting dialogue. On the paintings. She continues, she doesn't want it to be representing something. But the picture was not of them, she said, or not in this sense. There were other senses too, in which one might reference them, by a shadow here and a light there, for instance. Her tribute took that form if, as she vaguely supposed, the picture must be a tribute. It's an interesting thought. The picture, if it is not referential, and it is also not I'm not entirely sure what reference in this context here means. My feeling is it's important, but I can't make it clear now. So But if it's not referential, we can think of a picture as a tribute. A tribute is a complex thing. A tribute is something which we are obliged to deliver, but it's also something which we give back, or which we give in addition to, or which we give into a sharing. So a tribute is a kind of an economical notion outside of an economy. No? A mother and a child, she continues, might be reduced to a shadow without irreverence. A light here required a shadow there. So it's not really an economy that we usually relate to monies and to paying. No? So a tribute. And yet it is a kind of an economy, because if there is a balancing, no? If there is light here, there must be shadow there. So there is a kind of an order, there is a kind of a nature where one thing follows from another, where there is a kind of a consequentiality to things with which, as a painter, you can interact. He considered, he was interested. He took it scientifically in complete good faith. The truth was that all his prejudices were on the other side, he explained. So he did not want to see in these geometrical forms a complexity that he wants to relate to her. The largest picture in his drawing room, he tells her, which painters have praised and valued at a higher price than he had ever given for it, was of the cherry trees in blossom on the banks of the Kennet. He had spent his honeymoon on the banks of the Kennet, he said. Lily must come and see that picture. But now he turned with his glasses raised to the scientific examination of the canvas. The question being one of the relations of masses, of lights and shadows, which, to be honest, he had never considered before. He would like to have it explained. What then did she wish to make of it? And he indicated the scene before them. She looked. She could not show him what she wished to make of it, could not see it, even herself, without the brush in her hand. She took up once more her old painting position with the dim eyes and the absent-minded manner, subduing all her impressions as a woman to something much more general, becoming once more under the power of that vision, which she had clearly seen once, and must now grope for among edges and houses and mothers and children, her picture. It was a question, she remembered, how to connect this mass on the right hand with that on the left. She might do it by bringing the line of the branch across, so, etc. Yeah? So we have the interest of capturing something which appears with a great clarity but cannot be held on to. No? So this is the abstraction which is at play again. And the abstraction allows that there are many senses. No? Interesting as well. We skip this. And we go to what she gets from exposing her work to this. She says, but it had been seen, her picture. No? So there was no understanding, there was clumsiness, but there was interest, there was the incitation of interest. It had been seen, it had been taken from her. This man had shared with her something profoundly intimate. Yeah? You see, so there is a sharing, there is an exchange, there is a taking and a giving, which does not coincide with the level of the representation, or of the sense-making, or of the meaningfulness in a linguistic or in a communicative sense. No. This man had shared with her something profoundly intimate, and thanking Mr. Ramsey for it, and Mrs. Ramsey for it, and the hour and the place, crediting the world with a power which she had not suspected, that one could walk away down that long gallery, not alone anymore, but arm in arm with somebody, the strangest feeling of the world and the most exhilarating. She nicked the catch of her paint box, too, more firmly than was necessary, and the nick seemed to surround in a circle forever the paint box, the lawn, Mr. Banks, and that wild villain, Cam, dashing past. Cam is another character, it's another one of the 8 kids of the Ramseys. Yeah. So it's an interesting experience, which is we are not being told how to make sense of it. So this is part of this incredible voice of Virginia Woolf. We are witnessing, we are experiencing with the characters things that remain cryptic and yet acquire a certain reality. Yeah? So the experiencing of I will not try to explain it now. You have it in the text. I think this captures well what is happening here. This is a musing, it's a meditation by Mrs. Ramsey again. So here we witness her thinking about an episode with her husband. He was angry. Why take such a gloomy view of life, he said. Interesting. So by all we know, he's the gloomy person, no? Living in this abstract world. But to him she is. Why take such a gloomy view of life, he said. It is not sensible, for it was odd, and she believed it to be true, that with all his gloom and desperation he was happier, more hopeful on the whole than she was, less exposed to human worries. Perhaps that was it. He had always his work to fall back on, not that she herself was pessimistic, as he accused her of being, only she thought life and the little strip of time presented itself to her eyes, her 50 years. There it was before her, life, she thought, but she did not finish her thought. She took a look at life, for she had a clear sense of it there, something real, something private, which she shared neither with her children nor with her husband. A sort of transaction went on between them, in which she was on one side and life was on another, and she was always trying to get the better of it, as it was of her. And sometimes they parleyed, when she sat alone. There were, she remembered, great reconciliation scenes, but for the most part, oddly enough, she must admit that she felt this thing that she called life terrible, hostile, and quick to pounce on you if you gave it a chance. There were eternal problems, suffering, death, the poor. There was always a woman dying of cancer, even here, and yet she had said to all these children, you shall go through it. To 8 people. So she has 8 children. She had said relentlessly that. For that reason, knowing what was before them, love and ambition and being wretched, alone in dreary places, she had often the feeling, why must they grow up and lose it all? And this is the context where it started here. No? Her remark that, why need the children grow up and lose it all? So a projection of a happiness, of a wholeness, which precedes or which is possible as a child. Precisely this kind of transaction between oneself and life is not yet in place. In the second chapter, and I'm going to make it much shorter now, I wanted to give you a kind of an access to ask the questions we are dealing with regard to a theory of the arts, or with regard to a mind that is thinking mathematically. But let's see, nevertheless, how it goes, because the 3 parts, they are not a linear, so there is a lot of time passing in between the beginning and the end. The end will be many years later from the first scene, where Mrs. Ramsey has died. We don't exactly learn, I don't think I remember how she has died, but a similar constellation of people gather again after many years and actually undertake a trip to the Lighthouse. But in between there is the second chapter, which is entitled Time Passes. And what we have here is a way of thinking about the passing of time as if thinking of the table while you are not there. So how Virginia Woolf begins is this. Well, we must wait for the future to show, said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. It's almost too dark to see, said Andrew, coming up from the beach. One can hardly tell which is the sea and which is the land, said Prue. Do we leave that light burning, said Lily, as they took their coats off indoors. No, said Prue, not if everyone is in. Andrew, she called back, just put out the light in the hall. One by one the lamps were extinguished, except that of Mr. Carmichael, who liked to lie awake a little reading Virgil, kept his candle burning rather longer than the rest. Yeah. So time passes is the opening of a night. It's the opening of a night, and the only thing we get as the passing of time is really the experience of darkness, but as an experience of same quality like the other passages we have seen. So with the lamps all put out, the moon sank, and the thin rain drumming on the roof of a downpouring of immense darkness began. Nothing, it seemed, could survive the flood, the profusion of darkness which, creeping in at keyholes and crevices, stole around window blinds, came into bedrooms, swallowed up here a jug and a basin, there a bowl of red and yellow dahlias, there the sharp edges and firm bulk of a chest of drawers. Not only was furniture confounded, there was scarcely anything left of body or mind by which one could say, this is he or this is she. Sometimes a hand was raised as if to clutch something or ward off something, or somebody groaned, or something laughed aloud as if sharing a joke with nothingness. Nothing stirred in the drawing room or in the dining room or on the staircase. Only through the rusty hinges and swollen sea-moistened woodwork certain airs, detached from the body of the wind, crept around the corners and ventured indoors. Almost one might imagine them as they entered the drawing room, questioning and wondering, toying with the flap of hanging wallpaper, asking would it hang much longer? When would it fall? Then smoothly brushing the walls, they passed on musingly, as if asking the red and yellow roses on the wallpaper whether they would fade, and questioning gently, for there was time at their disposal, the torn letters in the wastepaper basket, the flowers, the books, all of which were now open to them, and asking were they allies? Were they enemies? How long would they endure? So you see, the passing of the time is not the passing of the time for people. It is not the time of memory. It's the passing of time that happens where one is not. Yeah, it's a material passing of time that is at stake in this chapter, and how to engage with it. So again, another constellation of a sea and a shore and a transcendental line, and the presence of a lighthouse and the plan to go there. What we get in the last part, in the part 3 with the lighthouse, is that Lily Briscoe actually remembers her painting which she was not able to finish. No, so where the one she was talking about with Mr. Banks before, where she didn't get in touch again with the vision that appeared so clear and that she tried to capture in her painting. After the many years, when going back there, she will finish the painting. We no longer learn what it is about and so on, but there is a kind of a closure that falls together with Mr. Ramsey and James and the other kids actually making a trip to the lighthouse. But going to the lighthouse, so the promise of this whole plot has somehow lost its energy. So what's the use of going now? No. So they are not. Nobody is really up to do it anymore, and yet they do it. Again, the book. This is the dust cover jacket of the first edition. It's a very interesting picture of a lighthouse. It's a kind of a, no, is it so? It's almost like an Trichter, so where you would pour in stuff and then it comes out. It's kind of a material passing of time, the lighthouse, but then the lighthouse is also interesting. No? So in an evident sense, it means a travel to the lighthouse, an excursion, an adventure going there, but it can also be a kind of an éloge, no? A kind of a praise. So to the lighthouse, a kind of a cheers. Yeah. So there's a dedication involved with it. This is certainly the way I want to read it. And I hope you will enjoy and find beautiful passages to do our substitution exercises. So to render thoughts uttered by all the authors that we are reading into setups where they are displaced, so you can learn to get in touch with what they are doing. Thanks for watching, and see you in our next session.